No, I'm recording.
Okay. All right. This is Janice, and now I get to introduce you to our speaker today, who is historian and author Chris Flook. Did I say that right? Who is a lifelong resident of Muncie, where he is an associate lecturer of media at Ball State University, teaching motion graphics, web design, and video production. And Chris also serves with the Delaware County Historical Society, and he's written 3 Muncie-related history books, as well as a column called ByGone Muncie History for the Muncie Star Press. And Chris is with us today to talk about his newest book, Indianapolis Graverobbing, a Syndicate of Death. And so I can hardly wait. And so I am going to turn things over to Chris right now.
Well, what I thought I'd do today is, I don't want to give away too much of the story, because I do hope people actually, buy the book and read it. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the greater arc of the story, and then the context of what led to a bunch of arrests and the events all happening pretty much in 1902 and 1903 that caused a international sensation of grave robbing. Grave robbing is nothing new. As long as there's been graves, there's been people to rob them. So that's thousands of years, people have been robbing graves. But in most cases, when people rob graves, they're going after jewelry, right? There's some sort of value. You all know the stories with British, really, 1800s robbing tombs in Egypt, and that's generally what people think about when you think about grave robbing. But my particular, or the grave robbing that's within the story I told is cadaver grave robbing, which is something very unique and very specific. But it's the idea of stealing corpses from graves and selling them to medical schools as cadavers. So then, as now, medical schools, as part of your training to become a doctor or a surgeon or a physician or a dentist or whatever, you practice on cadavers. That's part of it. Today we have mechanisms in place where if I die, I can donate my body to science. It can be used for training, and then it gets cremated and returned to my loved ones to be buried. That didn't really exist in any kind of meaningful way in the 19th century. The other thing that was typical in the 19th century was refrigeration and formaldehyde, which existed in the 19th century, but it was very expensive and hard to get. So, like today, a medical college would have, I don't need to make crass, but like stockpile bodies, because they have refrigeration and they have to do that didn't really exist that it could be affordable. So what happened was there was this difference between the demand from a college, from a medical college in places like Indianapolis, Chicago, Louisville, Cincinnati, Fort Wayne area, and then not enough bodies to be able to meet the needs of the students that were there. So it created this massive black market, essentially. This existed everywhere in the United States that had medical colleges. So in Indiana, most of the medical colleges were in Indianapolis. There was one in Fort Wayne. There was one in Michigan City briefly, in Greencastle, where DePaul is, called Asbury College. There was a medical college there. Louisville and Cincinnati, which are obviously not in the state of Indiana, but like those places, graves, cemeteries would be robbed in Indiana in the rural areas for it. What they often did is they targeted rural cemeteries where no street lights, no police presence, not a whole lot of people living in those areas. Someplace where you can go in the cover of night, dig up a body, and get it out within an hour or two and sell it to the medical college. What they would often do is they would use these kinds of tripod things. They would dig into the front end or the middle of the coffin, put a rope around the corpse and pull it out, pull all the dirt back. Or the more disgusting thing was they took a giant meat hook and jab it underneath someone's chin and pull it out. It's very insensitive. They targeted fresh graves because A, the medical colleges needed fresh cadavers, so that something the person had decomposed was not would not be beneficial to doctors in training. And then also, a sexton leaves for the day, a fresh grave had been dug, a funeral happens. They come back the next day, the dirt is going to look the same, even though someone might have still had it, because it was just dug and put back. So, sort of the way to get around it and caught. Grave robbing, in this sense, was a byproduct of the Enlightenment. which is a weird thing to think about, but it was. Scientific advancements in the 19th century happened so quickly that the culture and law did not catch up to it. Even like, I don't think there's anything wrong with donating bodies to science, but even today I feel a little, like it's a little awkward or a little squeamish for it. I think a lot of people do in the 19th century. So grave robbing becomes this major thing throughout Western world, Western Europe, United States, the Anglophone world, places like Canada, any place that had a medical college. The culture was not advanced enough or did not grow enough to be able to accept as space numbers, and so it created this black market. If you've ever read A Tale of Two Cities, there's a character named Jerry Cruncher. Jerry Cruncher moonlights as a resurrection man because he steals bodies. This is my favorite, one of my favorite things to put in. This is a political cartoon making fun of William Jennings Bryan for bringing back the idea of silverback currency. You know anything about William Jennings Bryan, which was the thing when he ran for office at the turn of the last century. And the joke here is that he's a resurrectionist digging up an old dead idea. And I put that in there because it is, everyone got that joke in the 1890s in, this was like Puck, the magazine Puck, because grave robbing was so pervasive. So they could make that joke, everyone got it because just how much they had to deal with. The law, culture, and science were not in sync. No one wants to be, even today, you don't want to be your surgeon's first person. Like we can all agree on that, right? Even in the 19th century, we agreed with population agreed with that as well. So everyone sort of generally understood the doctors needed adequate training. Well, how do you get the bodies to do that? That was fun. When the science changed so quickly, which is why the culture and law like took forever to catch up with it, we began the 19th century understanding disease that was called miasma theory. The idea was kook science, but it was the best they understood at the time that smelly bad things cause disease. They kind of understood the airborne infection, but they didn't have any understanding of bacteria, viruses, and all that. So you walk by a trash dump and it smells bad, well, you might get like some sort of, that was the idea. At the end of the century, we then had a full understanding, not a full, but like a solid understanding of bacteria, viruses, things that really did cause disease. Scientific understanding that could then be tested and then confirmed. 100 years is a long time. It really isn't. It's not really necessarily a cultural change. And so science needed something that the culture could not provide. And then as medical science evolves, then what sort of grows with that is the idea for anatomical research. So physicians, dentists, morticians, mortuary science becomes a thing after the Civil War, and they all needed actual people to be able to do that. Even today, with all our advancements in technology, all the virtual stuff that we can create, you're still going to train within the doctor. You're still going to train on that. So this situation exists. There are all kinds of historical events that happened throughout the late 18th and early 19th century to deal with grave robbing. One of the most prominent or early famous cases in the United States is the doctor's riots in 1788. Long story short, there's a medical school at Columbia College, and they for years have been ransacking primarily African American graves in New York. And then, so the city, just like any other area in the north at the time, had a degree of racism, so that was generally ignored until those doctors went after a this whole course of a white person in the entire city, created riots. They sacked the medical college, burned a bunch of stuff. The governor had to call the state militia in to quell the violence. This is 1788, right? So pretty early on in United States history. And this is something. The most famous case in the Anglophone world was William Burton's Hair. This was in Scotland. And these two guys were grave robbers, and they were stealing bodies for an anatomist named Robert Knox. Well, they decided they're just going to skip the whole grave robber business and just start murdering people, and then donating those bodies to Robert Knox. And Robert Knox claimed he had no idea where the bodies were coming from. But they get caught. William Hare, which is the guy that's on the right, he turned state's evidence, or whatever he put it was in Scottish. Scotland in the 19th century. Turns on Burke. Burke is found guilty. He is hung in front of a crowd of 25,000 people. His body is donated to science. It was then dissected, and then this is the creepiest thing. His body is still, or his skeleton is still on display at Edinburgh College in Scotland. I guess it's maybe a warning to people. I've not been there, it's not my photo, but like as of 2011. So, oh, wow. More famous locally, before my story takes place, was the theft of the body of John Scott Harrison. Probably don't know John Scott Harrison. You know his dad, William Henry Harrison, who was governor of Indiana Territory and was president of life of Congress. Then his son, so William Henry Harrison's grandson, Benjamin Harrison, who was also president, governor of Indiana. Well, his body was stolen by a resurrectionist named Charles Morton and sold to the Ohio Medical College in Cincinnati. That's not the weird part. So the weird part is how his body was discovered. His body was discovered by his son, accidentally, essentially. So when John Scott dies, he's buried in the family plot. And Benjamin and all, huge family, they're all there. One of his sons, John Scott Jr.,
Was that in Indiana?
no, this was in North Bend, Ohio. All essentially Cincinnati. But like,
all right, Chris,
yeah.
can you please let me know when you're changing
Sure.
slides, because I'm behind.
Gotcha. Okay, you're on the right slide now.
Where are you?
The slide that you have up now is correct.
Okay, just tell me when you're changing slides, please.
Yeah, I've just changed slides. Go ahead and change forward. All right, so what the weird part about it is that his son found it. His son was at the funeral. He sees that his friend's grave, who also died of like tuberculosis like a couple weeks earlier, his friend's grave, Augustus Devon, has been disturbed. So after the funeral, after his dad's funeral, he goes, he gets the sexton and a constable, they dig up the grave, and sure enough, Augustus Devon's body is missing. So then he gets a court order to go and search the Ohio Medical College looking for his friend Augustus Devon. Doesn't find Augustus Devon, finds his dad naked, his body was dad naked, hanging down some sort of shaft that the doctors tried to hide because they realized this high-profile person was stolen and this other high-profile person was taken. John Scott Jr. gets very upset, obviously, because he sees his dad there, and is cut down, reburied underneath steel plates in North Bend, Ohio. John Scott Jr. recovers himself, and then a couple weeks later figures out where his friend is, finds his friend, Augustus Devon, brining the pickleback up in the University of Michigan. So, tells you a little bit about it. One of the reasons I tell the story because it was local, but also because this is just how pervasive the network was. If someone's body was stolen in Cincinnati, it was up and taken to Michigan. All right, changing slides. Now, in Indiana, the General Assembly kind of plays a part in all of this, inadvertently. They, from very early on, would try to regulate, if you want to practice medicine in the state of Indiana, you got to get a license. So they set up the State Medical Society in 1819, set up in regions. If you want a license, you got to go before this board, prove your credentials, and then get a license. For some very dumb reason, they repealed that in 1843 and have no licenses. So if you want to practice medicine in Indiana and it's 1845, sure. There is no requirement preventing you from like doing it in that. That obviously doesn't work out. So in 1885, they come up with a new law that says if you want to practice medicine, you can get your license from the county clerk. Now, I love my county of Delaware, but like I would not trust my county, you know. And so that didn't work out too well. And so eventually in 1897, they created the State Board of Medical Registration and Examination, which is today the state medical system. So you want to practice law or practice medicine, you got to go in front of this group. The latter two laws, like the reason why I want to discuss this is because what you had to do to prove that you were competent was a graduate certificate from some reputable medical college with no definition of what a reputable medical college was. You had to graduate from somewhere. So then that creates all these people that want to become doctors got to go to school, right? And so all of a sudden, then in major cities, just in Indiana, you see medical schools pop up all over the place. But there was never enough bodies because of all the reasons I said: lack of easy and affordable refrigeration, lack of easy and affordable like formaldehyde, that kind of thing. There was a better and larger demand for corpses than what the law was able to provide. Grave robbing becomes an issue not long after the Civil War in the state of Indiana, so the General Assembly tries to curtail that. Always a couple steps behind. So in 1875, they passed a law that says if you were caught grave robbing, it's a $2,000 fine and you're in jail. $2,000 was the enormous amount of money. And that did nothing. Did nothing. Didn't do anything to stop the grave robbing at all. Then there was a couple other laws passed, but the more significant one that relates to my story in my book is 1899, where they also said if you are in possession of stolen corpse, doctors, anatomy colleges, you are also liable for a fine. And it also really didn't do much. Really ultimately occurred. The General Assembly was trying to. There are several tons. In fact, the second chapter of my book, I cover maybe a dozen pretty prominent grave robbing cases leading up to the story in my book in 1902. This was a pretty prominent one, a German-American immigrant in the south side of Indianapolis. His daughter was stolen and started for grave robbing. I put this in here because at the end, these outrages are becoming too frequent, and there seems now no security against the people. This is in 1873, and already there's a problem, and the newspapers are saying this is a common thing that's happening in the city. They were targeted rural cemetery. I'm sorry, I'm not telling you what I'm doing. I am on slide targeted rural cemeteries. I apologize if we got one more. Next, yeah, there you go. Perfect. Now, you all know where Norfolk Park is, right? South side of Indianapolis. At the time, around 1900, it was the south end of Indianapolis. German Catholic cemetery. I don't remember the name of this cemetery, but the edge of town. No street lights, not a lot of people living there. Cops are not going to be there. It's easy to go in, take a corpse, steal a corpse, and get out. Still within proximity of downtown Indianapolis, where all the schools. Next slide. Greenlawn Cemetery has popped up in the news a lot recently. If you've been paying attention, this is where maybe a new soccer stadium or you now have 2 soccer teams coming to Indianapolis. I don't really understand. But Greenlawn Cemetery was a city cemetery that existed from basically the founding of Indianapolis until about 1880s, 1890s. There's actually several cemeteries grouped together that came and went over time. The cemetery always had problems because it was on the river, and so it flooded a lot, and so it just caused problems. It was also a target for grave robbers early on. It was a city cemetery, so it had a lot of pauper graves, and so folks I think the grave robbers thought and know that was sort of the logic. Cemetery closes in 1890s. And they start moving bodies to Crown Hill Cemetery. And when they went in to dig up some of the bodies from the 1880s, 1890s, there was no. Like a lot of people had already. When they started the construction of the soccer stadium, like within 2 weeks, they found bodies. Like immediately. So that there's still stuff. It's obviously a very controversial thing, but it was sort of the epicenter of grave robbing in Indianapolis after the Civil War. Yeah. Next slide is Indy 11 Park, the plan here, and this is just the Indian Greenlawn Cemetery. But easily connected by roads to downtown. So you can get a body, get into downtown in the middle of the night, there's a very good chance. Next slide. The other sort of major epicenter of it it was the area around the Central Hospital for the Insane. Huge mental health facility in Indianapolis that operated for a very long period of time. There were people there that would work with grave robbers under the table to get corpses of people that died there that were claimed. They had their own cemetery that was robbed a lot, and then the Mount Jackson Cemetery, suburb at the time, but the cemetery is right behind it, right behind you today, is right up where the hospital was. When it was targeted. Again, rural edge of town, not a lot of police, no street lights, accessible to get back into downtown. Next slide. Now, and when my story takes place, pretty much all of it is in fall of 1902 through the end of the trials in summer of 19. At that time, there was about a dozen medical colleges, dental colleges within the city of Indianapolis. Some were involved in the grave robbing and got caught. Some were involved and didn't get caught. Some were not involved at all. So, on the quality of the school and who they did. Three ringleaders were the Central College of Physicians and Surgeons, the Eclectic Medical College, and the Physio Medical College. Those three were sort of at least the ones that got caught that had a lot of the stolen corpses or were behind a lot of the traffic. Next slide. Now, in the United States, as you know, there's a market for everything, right? It doesn't matter what it is, there's a market for everything. So as this problem of grave robbing comes to be in the United States, all kinds of things are invented and sold to the public to prevent their corpse from getting stolen. One of them is the vaults that we still use today. It's used for many different reasons. But vaults become popular in part during this era because of grave robbing. Your casket is put down into a steel or a masonry vault. It becomes very difficult for that grave robber to then do it in his grave, or at least in the very least be. Next slide. This was patented in Fort Wayne. This was basically a steel cage that was buried, and the coffin went into that, and then they welded it shut and put the dirt on it. So it'd be like very difficult for a grave robber to be able to do that. But they're essentially called mort safes or mortuaries. They're very common. There's all kinds of different models that exist. Made it very difficult. Next slide. This is my favorite, the guns. This is from Google Patents, so someone really invented this. This was a torpedo gun. What happened was it was spring loaded, and grave robbers dig them down, they open up the coffin, they would trigger this torpedo to fire into the hole and then blow up, destroying the corpse in the coffin, but also the person that was there to grave rob you. That was not very common. This was more common. This was a grave gun. It was just a regular old gun. The same idea. The lid was open, and then it would trigger the shot to the person's face. Trying to I've done about 3 or 4 different patents, all in the 1870, 1880 time frame. They only needed it to work for like a couple of weeks, because after a couple of weeks, your body wasn't really valuable to the medical colleges. So some of this stuff I can only assume is still down underneath the ground. This woman, I don't know if it was her or her family. Her name was Sarah Bishop. She died. She lived in Franklin, which is, what county is that? Johnson County. Johnson County in the 1890s was the epicenter of grave robbing. Close enough to medical colleges by train or interurban, and lots of rural areas that have been targeted. This woman dies. Either her family or at her request, she was buried in a bunch of nitroglycerin. It was reported in the papers that I assume it's like, hey, don't go steal this woman's body because there's a bunch of nitroglycerin. Anything about nitroglycerin is very unstable. Any kind of movement or impact can I can only believe that it's still there. This is from Finding Grave from 2011. And so I can only assume that all that nitroglycerin is still underneath the next slide. Now, so with all this in mind, what happens in the story that I cover in my book? In fall, September of 1902, about 7 men are arrested for grave robbing. All of them were African Americans. Important part of the story. Keep that in mind. The ringleader was this guy here, a man by the name of Rufus Cantrell. And the doctors, immediately after their arrest, all claimed that, oh my gosh, he had no idea he was stealing places. He thought he was getting it legitimately. Oh my gosh, this is terrible. What can we do to help, right? And he realizes that, like, okay, screw these guys. In terms of him and his, not all of them, but him and his lieutenant, Sam here, do the same thing. They provide top as much information that it possibly can provide about what is going on in the city of Indianapolis, in central Indiana proper, dealing with so he is very much the ringleader. His counterpart at Central College is a man by the name of Joseph Alexander, the paid anatomist. He's in charge of preparing bodies legally, that's how he was tasked with doing, and then performing like not public, but like demonstrative dissections. If you've ever been to the medical museum, it's down by the old Central Hospital. They've got this really great room where the operating table and then the students would sit up in kind of like a movie theater style seating. That's exactly the kind of this. Now, how he yeah. I'm sorry. Next slide. One more. Yeah, there you go. Okay. Now, how they got caught was because Rufus essentially turned himself in. Rufus, or someone, it's not very clear in the newspapers, but it was an African-American man that description matched the newspaper. That's generally what everyone at the time thought it was Rufus. Someone starts slipping notes under people's doors that says, your loved one has been stolen from the cemetery. If you want this person back, you need to go to the medical. So he does this to a woman by the name of Julia Middleton. And Julia Middleton, her daughter died earlier that summer from tuberculosis. Pretty common at the time. And then she gets a note a couple months later that says her daughter's body has been stolen and it's at the Central College. She obviously freaks out. So consults family members. The family's like, you need to go to the cops. She goes to the cops. They give her a warrant with a constable, and she goes to Central College surgeons. Sure enough, in the basement is her daughter, Stella Middleton, that had not been donated to something. Very upset. The body is taken and buried. Then all of a sudden, all these questions start popping up. Someone, probably Cantrell, is doing this throughout the city. Another guy in Irvington gets a note in the middle of the night saying your wife, who had died the week before, is at the college. So there's all of a sudden now the public has become outraged. They knew this existed. It wasn't a surprise to anybody. But people are now getting notes under their door. And so people are very upset. And so they start going after the police to, do something. Next slide. So families start digging. They start digging. First off, they call the police. This is probably about 30, 40 families. They call the police, and the police are like, we don't have the person power to investigate every grave. Like, we have to dig into 100 graves. It's not realistic. Why don't you do it? So these family members then went out to these cemeteries and then dug in to see if their loved one had been buried or not. And many are empty. And so this creates a sensational story. Lots of people, as you can imagine, are very upset in Indianapolis because this happens. Next slide. At first, the story is kind of ignored because Teddy Roosevelt comes into town at the very end of September of 1902. And oddly, he was supposed to go around to other places in Indiana to do speeches. He got hit by a trolley like a month before or something like that. He had an abscess on his legs and he was rushed into surgery where doctors who are also stealing corpses are then performing this surgery. Anyways, the Indianapolis police assigned 2 officers, 2 detectives to become the sort of lead behind the investigation. One guy is named Adolf Asch. He is a Jewish man from France, from Alsace, which is sometimes Germany, but at the time it was France. Moves to the United States. I don't forget how he came to Indianapolis, but comes to Indianapolis, gets a job as a bicycle patrolman, and works his way up to the town. His counterpart is a man named Chauncey Yanning, who came from Ohio, I believe. Was a detective at the time that the graverobbers were caught. And the papers all sort of describe him as like a masterful interrogator. He is, both of them together become somewhat celebrities within town because every day or every other day there appears to be an article about their investigation. Next slide. So what ends up happening is after Roosevelt leaves, they realize the extent of the grave robbing, getting lots of information. Everyone's saying Cantrell's lying, Cantrell's lying, Cantrell's lying. Every grave the cops go to explore is missing, so they know he's being truthful. He turns in lots of people. He is one of, they are the only African-American group of grave robbers that is reported. There were maybe 4 or 5 other groups operating in central Indiana. All of them were white. But of course, then, because the way society was at the time, African Americans were rarely targeted, just disproportionately from, you know, what was going on. The Cantrell turns on everybody. Everybody that he had ever had contact with, other people, other groups and gangs, he turns them. There's lots of other grave robbers that are operating. Some of whom are connected well in the city of Indianapolis, but they have trouble, the prosecution cops have trouble hiding it because the public is so outraged. Next slide. They also arrest about 6 doctors who were involved. There was so much evidence behind it, behind their culpability in being involved with it. None of the colleges that were involved were keeping adequate records required by law. So there was multiple things that they were doing wrong. They were getting caught. With one exception, nothing ends up happening to these guys at all. This guy, William Moult, gets arrested, pays bonds, and then conveniently goes to New York City to study throat surgery, something like that. Comes back at the end of 1903 when everything has sort of disappeared, and ends up having a wonderful career in Indianapolis. He gets a job, I'm sure, just has his obituary says nothing about grave robbing. William Wright is a little more of a sinister, shadowy character. He also disappears conveniently during the trials and comes back, and nothing happens to him. He ends up having a private practice throughout until he dies in 1950. But with one exception, Joseph Alexander, everybody else absolutely happens to him. And nothing even really happens to Joseph Alexander. He is put on trial. He is the first grave robber to be put on trial. There was an enormous amount of evidence against him. For instance, him and Rufus would go to the, they would go to the health board every single day and get a list of people who had died. And they did this for like 6 months, and no one had never raised any red flags. Why these 2 people were coming in and getting a list of dead people. So there was like eyewitnesses and like evidence that he was involved. He's tried. The trial ends in a hung jury. Basically, prosecutors say that they're going to go after him again. Which is a lot of the people that were witnesses kind of got their feet and activated. He becomes the head company physician for Central Gas, or whatever the gas company was, Citizens Gas, thank you. In Indianapolis. Born in Hamilton County, was a doctor, got hired at Central College to be the chief anatomist. He was required to procure bodies legally, but of course. Next slide. One more slide, one more. We're on right there again. This guy, he was the head or maybe a lone grave robber, not operating in Marion County, operating in Hamilton County. He was Grave Hampton West. He has his own kind of creepy story. He was born in North Carolina, was a Confederate soldier, fought in the Battle of Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, was wounded because he was scarred in his face. He was in anything about the Battle of Chancellorsville. The Confederates fired accidentally on their own commander, wounded Stonewall Jackson, who eventually died. It was his unit that fired accidentally on their own commander. So I don't know if it was because of that or the Battle of Gettysburg. He defects from the Confederate Army. Thinks it's a really good idea to come to Indiana. Right? And so he moves first to like Franklin, and it does not go well because he was Confederate. Then he moves to Castleton. So Castleton either didn't know or whatever. He then stays basically in Hamilton County for the rest of his life. Somewhere around, runs a saloon, gets mixed up in the law like a lot in the 1890s. He doesn't get caught up until Rufus turns him in, basically, but everybody knows in town because this guy shows up to everything. And he's like really bad news. He stole the body of his niece. He's just like a really terrible, awful thing. He is the last person to be tried in summer of 1903. He's found guilty. Sentenced to prison, he goes to Michigan State, and then dies in prison. Rufus is a deeply, deeply, deeply fascinating. Now, I should caution that a lot of my research for the book came from newspapers, whatever else I could find. So that should send up multiple red flags, right? Newspapers were written primarily by white men, right? And it doesn't mean that they were being dishonest. It just means that, like, you read it with a grain of salt. Like, is everything they're saying correct? But the reporters make it very clear that this guy is very charismatic. He's well liked. The prosecution likes him. Police like him. His crew likes him. The mayor goes to visit him for some reason. There's like all kinds of connections where sort of suggests that he is a much bigger player in Indianapolis than just Grave. He was a Republican, which was very common for African Americans at the time in Indianapolis. So he was well connected politically. Ran prior to grave robbing, his name appears often in newspapers as studying for, you name it, conservative or GOP politician. He was young at the time that he was arrested in 1902. He's like 21. He was born in Gallatin, Tennessee, moved up to Indianapolis in the 90s with his family. His job as an undertaker, which I can only assume is probably where he started grave robbing. Moves around a bit, was in the army, was kicked out of the army for mental instability. He later claimed that he just like faked, he put like soap in his mouth and all the stuff he's doing cartoons, like he did that. And they kicked him out of the army, well. And then sometime in the 1890s, starts grave robbing. He is known as a prolific grave robber within the city of Indianapolis. Next slide. So what I did in the book is I read all the newspapers. This is my pandemic project. The pandemic hits, like a lot of people have a lot of extra time. I'm like, I know about the story for a fair amount of time. And so I wanted to do a little bit more research on it, and then at the end of that research, I realized easily. Indianapolis News and the Indianapolis Journal, where one was morning and one was evening, I forget which one, but like they covered it so well that pretty much every day between September of 1902 until when the trials, up into and through the trials in spring, there's a grave robbing article. So hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, front page stuff, whole huge spreads. I found stuff in newspapers all over the United States, but less accurate. These two newspapers tended to have the best sort of coverage. Every newspaper that I can find in Indianapolis covers it. Indianapolis Recorder, which, as you know, leading African American newspaper then and now, they are very critical of this, and mostly like op-eds. They don't really cover the story, but they are very, very clear and very critical of Rufus and just the great robbing in general. Hamilton County newspapers had a lot of stuff. Muncie Star, where I'm at Bracken, I've all said that Bracken has good archival stuff, like microfilm. Tedious to do the research and get in the pandemic, I couldn't do it, so I was able to put out constructive stories. Any newspaper, then or now, but especially then, should be read with a critical eye. Right? I don't say it's biased, but the kinds of standards that we have for journalism today, such as they are, weren't necessarily something that was practiced 100 years ago. This is the era of yellow journalism. What I love about it is the language. Famine of cadavers, Syndicate of Death. I use this throughout the book. I use part of it in my subtitle, simply because the journalists had field day at the time, and the newspapers around the country had field day at the time as well. So like a lot of that sort of just ties into just how news was reported. But New York papers, Chicago papers, papers in Paris and London, Canada, lots of papers covered it because it was so sensational. In summer of 1902 alone, Cantrell estimated that anywhere from 100 to 300 bodies were stolen. What happened was when a lot of the doctors went to, they got these court orders to go and, search a lot of these medical schools, all the bodies were gone. In fact, all bodies were gone, including legal ones. So they shipped them off to other medical colleges. And so there was this article in December of 1902 that the people studying were experiencing a famine of cadavers because they worried about corpses to be able to do it. By the second half of the book is all the trials, beginning with Alexander's trial. It goes for 2 weeks and ends in a hung jury. Prosecutors claim that they try to try it again. It doesn't happen. Then Sam, the Rufus Cantrell's lieutenant is tried, found guilty. Rufus is tried, found guilty. 2 or 3 other grave robbers plead guilty. They were given pretty light sentences. And then Wade Hampton West is tried in Hamilton County in summer. And so there's a whole sort of year there, or 6 months, that the trials are covered well. If you're into that kind of criminal history or legal history, you might enjoy the book. Okay, next slide. One more, next one. One more, where it says, yeah, racism. Okay, now I've known about this story. There's even a marker about a grave robbing battle a gun battle between Wade West and Rufus at a cemetery right along the Marion County line. And the two sort of came to terms because West had to sell his corpses in Indianapolis. And so Cantrell becomes like a middleman. So they do this like literally blood oath where they cut their hands and like touch blood. And Cantrell breaks that bond as he turns the life. I wrote about the story for many years and knew some of the characters with it. I suspected there was probably some sort of racist element to it. So it was like, in the way that it was reported, it wasn't like Cantrell and his crew were innocent, but they were no more guilty than anybody else involved. And the society at the time went after the black. Disproportionate amount of legal repercussions for those folks, but for no one else. And so I can completely sympathize as to why Rufus turned state's evidence. Next slide. Except this one might have some trouble on the audio. It's a documentary. It's from a documentary in the 80s. It's very short. It's a short clip. There was another doctor by the name of Link. And Link was never mentioned in the 1902 and 1903 newspaper reports, but he was very much involved. And here he is, 80 years later, giving an interview about grave robbing.
I have been assistant to the Confederate college, and among other things, he had me receiving the cadaver that came in. And they were brought in by a colored fellow who was a resurrector, what we call a resurrector. Otherwise, he was a graverobber. He bring in a cadaver, and if it was a woman, he cut her hair off, rolled up, put it in his pocket, opened her mouth, and she had a gold tooth, he knocked it off, put that in his pocket. He just that kind of stuff. They found out he was doing these grave robbings, and they arrested him and put him in jail. Durham ran over and told him Durham was a demonstrator, not to mention his name or mine. So they never mentioned that. He was a great talker, but they never mentioned it. But they sent him to penitentiary.
Well, he clearly sees and takes no shame in his involvement of it, which I think probably is representative of how most of the doctors felt at the time, right? They knew this was going on. All the grave robbers said that some of the doctors, particularly the students, would go out with them to go grave robbing, which was part of like the culture at the time to do it. And so even 80 years later, these people involved didn't feel any guilt for their involvement. Next slide. The other thing too that I hope people like the book, what I put in the book, is all kinds of very things that just didn't really have a good resolution. The woman I told you about at the beginning, Julia Middleton, who found a note under her door about her daughter's body. Stella, well, the reason that Rufus did that is because Stella Middleton was his girlfriend. And when she died, he was out of Indianapolis. And comes back, and we can only assume is sad about her death. He continues grave robbing. One evening, goes and steals a grave of a corpse of a young woman. Can't see because it's night. He goes back to Central College of Physicians and Surgeons, and in the light, he sees that it's his girlfriend that he just stole. So the story, as he told it, was he got very upset, and that's what he started turning himself to grave. That's just weird, right? Completely weird sort of science. There's another person by the name of Wallace Sims, who's probably one of the doctors, F.M. Wright, it's not clear. Wallace Sims was the pen name for someone that starts writing letters to the Indianapolis Journal, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, all these newspapers making up all kinds of crazy things about Rufus Cantrell. And the suspicion, even with the police at the time, was one of the doctors trying to push the blame away from everybody else. And they just created this character named Wallace Sims. No one knew, no one understood that a lot of these newspapers were good. The craziest story is that a bunch of corpses found in an ice cream factory. So what happened was, as this investigation is going on, they get rumors that there are 36 bodies held in an ice cream factory in Louisville. So the suspicion from a lot of the police was that, well, the hospital, the colleges shipped off all the bodies at night so they would get caught. So they get a permission to go down and search the ice cream factory in Louisville. Sure enough, there are 30 bodies, dead bodies, hanging out back in the cold storage. None of them are from Indianapolis. They were all legal bodies that were procured in Louisville. That one of the colleges made an agreement with the ice cream company to store the cadavers in the bag. And this was just normal. This is like you have refrigeration. But it ended up being nothing. It was like perfectly legal. Everything was legal, so they come back. A lot of the bodies that had been stolen that were in the colleges at the time when Rufus was studying his notes. There's a lot of people at the time that never got any closure for what happened. So I encourage you to read the book. It's pretty short. I read it in the afternoon. It's very well cited. I put really good about it. It's like public history, so it's not designed for academics. Next slide, please. I want it to be accessible and open to everybody. Even if you're not interested in reading the book, just go read the newspaper articles. You go to the Hoosier State Chronicles, which is a free online source. The Indiana State Library. I use newspapers.com, and so it's easy to get the Star and Journal and news. And it's all searchable, so I can search for Cantrell, graverobbing, resurrector, and that kind of thing. You will see that there will be hundreds of articles between 1902 and that's it. So I got, yeah.
Okay, I put down, when you said Rufus Cantrell, 1580, but no question marks about when he died and how did he die.
That's very good. Okay. So I know the story too. Rufus, after he goes to jail, he's in Jeffersonville for a while, and then starts saying all kinds of prison stories. Saying he's like a shot at everything, just like nuts stuff. And the warden down there kind of allows this, so he allows journalists to come in. So the state moves Cantrell to Michigan City. So he goes to Michigan City. He's serves out his prison term. He's released in 1908. Not allowed to move back to Indianapolis after during the time of his parole. So he moves to Anderson and gets a job as in a foundry. And then I guess the parole ends or whatever, you can't live here is over. He then moves back to Marion County and starts becoming active in politics. But he switches parties. He switches from Republican to Democrat, which then causes him all kinds of personal problems because, there's politics are a little more violent than as they are now. He leans into his grave robbing image. He's like, goes after a mayor and he's like, I should have stolen his body. And that's just like crazy stuff that becomes kind of a celebrity. He leaves, moves to Ohio, is briefly there in Ohio, then leaves again and moves to Detroit. He's also a preacher. I should have begun with that. He's a preacher. He preached briefly in a church in Indianapolis, in an African American church in Indianapolis. They kick him out because he is a shady character. And he actually goes to that church, asks him for bail money. The church is like, no, we are not giving you bail money. We're going to rot in jail. Anyway, so he then goes to Detroit and starts preaching again at the church. The church was some sort of scam where he would be preaching and then his wife at the time and someone else would come and pick people's pockets. He gets caught, is arrested, and is sentenced to prison and goes up to Marquette Prison, the state prison in Michigan. He's up there maybe for like 2 years, is released, and then starts working for the Ipswich and something railroads, whatever like the only railroad in the upper peninsula at the time. And then the last physical evidence that we have from him is he fills out a draft card, a World War I draft card, where he fills out who he is, where he's working, where he's living. That's like 1918, and that's it. He completely disappears. He's not on the 20 census, he's not on the 1930 census. There are 3 other Rufus Cantrells that I can find living in the United States at the time, but they're all white. They're all white or older or different age. It's clearly not this Rufus Cantrell. Something happened to him, or he absconded to Canada or changed his name or something else where he's never caught. So that's why there is no. I was hoping someone would read the book and it's like, I know, or he's like, here's my great grandfather, like hopefully something will come out, you know. Because I do.
Would they really want to admit that?
Yeah. Well, he was married. There's records of him married at least 3 times, and his first wife had a son. And there's nothing that I can find in genealogy. He appears on like Ancestry.com in people's trees, but nothing from him. So whatever children he had, whatever people he was married to, with one exception, the woman in Michigan, there's no marriage records, nothing.
That sounds like a book in itself.
Right, about Rufus. Well, hopefully you all, you'll find out where he is or what happened to him. Yeah. I don't know that. In Indiana, the whole reason I know this story is because in a column that I write for Star Press, we were writing that column for about 7 years. There was a grave robbing attempt in a small little community called DeSoto, maybe 100 people, about an hour or a half hour north of Muncie, within Delaware County. And the attempt was stopped by farmers in the area. They caught the people trying to chase them out of town. That was in winter of 1904. That is one of the last in central Indiana that I could find. What happens after that is the medical college, the state is like, okay, this is we cannot have this. They try to then really go after the whole practice of it. A lot of the schools closed, and very briefly, there are 2 medical colleges in Indianapolis. One is Purdue and one is IU. And the General Assembly is like, where are we going to fund it? And then Purdue's goes away, and that is essentially where IU School of Medicine comes from, and still exists today. Ultimately comes from that effort. That's like a 1905, 1906 era. And then refrigeration becomes cheaper, formaldehyde becomes cheaper. So the medical colleges that then come in after that, including IU, are reputable, but they actually have the resources and the technology to be able to stockpile it. It's an easier way because you can stockpile cadavers throughout the year because you have a refrigerator. You have a morgue essentially in the bottom of your school. Yeah.
Have you ever thought about doing research with mortuaries and how they have in the past years it's been documented that they've been stockpiling bodies, but it wasn't because they were selling them to the schools. They were not wanting to pay for the burials and stuff like that.
I have not researched. That would be an interesting nature. Yeah. I do know that there was a couple of undertakers that were involved. One man by the name of C.N.C. Willis. He would work with Cantrell and his crew to bury empty coffins. That like the body didn't quite make it to the cemetery. They were like taken out. So they were never indicted. They were indicted, but they were never tried. There was like 2 or 3 folks in town, morticians that were involved.
Willis was fun.
Yeah.
Oh, I've seen pictures that are supposed to be designed to scare you and think of Dracula or vampires or zombies or something, where they put like a metal gate or a cage over the top of the grave.
Yeah.
I assume that's now, after your talk, it's really for grave robbers, to prevent grave robbers.
Not so much anymore, but at the time it certainly was.
Yeah.
There was lots of those devices, cages, vaults, things that would keep people.
Yeah, so in older cemeteries, you might find that
Yeah.
visible
Yep.
on top of the ground.
And then they come from graverobbing. Yeah.
Oh, this Willis, was he a mortician?
Yeah.
He had a funeral home on the west side of Indianapolis?
Is it?
That's your mother?
I don't remember. I know it was Willis. It was. I remember it as CMC Willis. Men, as you know, like often just abbreviated. Charles Willis or something like that, CMC Willis.
How much money did a body?
$30 to $50, and then, which was a lot at the time, and so then Rufus would say he got $50, would pay out of that $50 to his crew, and then any cops he was bribing, any sextons he was bribing, any morticians he was bribing, all came out of that $50. He said that each term was negotiated, so what would happen is a leader of one of the grave robbing crews, and there were like 7 in the area, would go to someone like Alexander, and he'd be like, okay, I need 40 bodies, I'll give you $50 a month. Like, great, I'll go get them legally, and then, you know, come back every other night with the.
Were there any recorded grave robbings in Crown Hill?
No, not in this era. I think maybe early on. Crown Hill had a wall, armed guards, and then a call box system. It was well lit. It was at the time kind of at the edge of town. There was still like people living, and so it was generally avoided. In my town, in Muncie, the same thing happened. Beech Grove, which is our big city cemetery, was ignored. It was all like smaller rural places, like on the way from Muncie to Indianapolis.
But during that time frame, was there any embalming done at the funeral home? So these bodies were.
Some bodies were embalmed. It sort of depends on how much money you had. Embalming, it existed for hundreds of years, was perfected after the Civil War, but not a lot of funeral homes did it. Not a lot of people could afford to do the embalming. It sort of just depended.
Did that have a difference, like the value of the corpse?
No, but this is but what did, this is, I hate this gross saying it, people that had disabilities, people that were really tall or overweight, like significantly overweight, because it was valued by the doctors for, you know.
Really wanted to check these oddities out.
Yeah.
I've given my body to science, and now you come.
Today they took very respectful. Your body is going into science.
We will come dig you up.
They will go, they're very respectful. The body has been burnt, cremated, and then passed back to them. So it is a very respectful. They want people to do it, so they are going to be very respectful.
How this changed, or, you know, your body
I don't know. I did a little bit of research on that. That really didn't come to be until after World War II. I think that was more of a culture. You could do it at the time, but I don't think that. Yeah. After World War II, I don't know what changed the culture. Something did where it became acceptable and normal and okay.
There's a cemetery across the street from where Central State used to be. Is that the one that's associated with those Central State Mental Hospital? I think you said it was Jackson.
Yeah, Mount Jackson Cemetery is the one. The Central States had their own cemetery in the back.
Oh, okay, so
unmarked.
it's their property.
Yeah.
Because there's one across the street.
Correct.
I used to work out that way, so I
Yeah.
know that cemetery.
Both cemeteries were targeted because of just.
And they're excavating those now and trying to get that.
They were very. It was we did not respect the dead for many years.
I went on a tour at Crown Hill. They had an arborist and a cultural historian. It was really interesting. But the cultural historian was talking about at Crown Hill the slabs, and that's what they did for falls. They did.
Slabs over the top.
Yeah, but they'd have to wait like 3 days for the slab to be put on top so the family members.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. During that time.
I'm sorry.
Was today's meeting recorded?
Yes.
And then you have a PowerPoint. I encourage you to share the PowerPoint. Yeah. It's
Absolutely.
big. It's a big file. There's not a lot of video in it, but
Thank you so much. It's been really
I
good.
appreciate you coming up.